The flipped classroom. It would be surprising if you haven't heard this term. It's created a big buzz in education the past few years, but is it something you should try on with your students? In the next few minutes, we'll investigate this instructional model, its benefits, some pitfalls, and walk through some next steps if you think it's right for you. Every traditional class includes portions that take place in and outside of the class period. The cycle most of us are familiar with is where students look over materials outside of class the night before, sit through a lecture or other form of instruction during class the next day, then attempt to complete the homework outside of class on their own. You probably recognize the student in this picture. Maybe you've been the student in this picture. She's alone, she's working on homework, and she's stuck. She's racking her brain to remember when her teacher demonstrated how to solve this kind of problem during her first class of the morning, and she's drawing a complete blank. She doesn't have many options. Give up in frustration and go to class tomorrow with incomplete work, or practice doing each problem the wrong way over and over to get something down on paper, cementing the incorrect method in her brain. Neither of these options are ideal. There must be a better way. Enter the flipped classroom model. As you can see from this 2015 graphic from the University of Texas, a flipped classroom changes the landscape of learning. The night before, a student watches their teacher present the content of the lesson. This is often delivered in an online video format. He or she can take notes and rewatch the video as needed. The next day, rather than passively sitting through the direct instruction, the student gets to practice the learning right there in the classroom with his or her classmates and teacher as resources who can provide immediate feedback. That night, the student has a chance to practice and extend their learning, again, at their own pace. So now let's compare the two models side by side. Flipping our classroom is starting to make a lot of sense. In the flip model, students acquire the necessary knowledge before class, giving teachers time to guide student practice and help them interact with and apply the knowledge they just learned during class. It seems like this model is bound to improve student learning, but what does the research say? I think the biggest advantage of the flipped classroom model was articulated by Bill Tucker in his 2002 article entitled The Flipped Classroom. Tucker succinctly explains, online instruction at home frees class time for learning. Let that sink in a minute. Online instruction at home frees class time for learning. That's powerful stuff. This rethinking of the instructional model protects and maximizes the scarcest instructional resource of all, time. A teacher from Colorado had this to say about flipped instruction. I now have time to work individually with students. I talk to every student in every class every day. When teachers have more dedicated time to work with struggling students, they can help these kids work through the challenging problems that would have had them banging their heads on the table at home. Teachers also credit the flip model with helping them form better, more authentic relationships with students, increasing student engagement, and leading to higher levels of student motivation. The flip model allows for more independence for students to personalize the learning and experience more choice. And deep student discourse gives students a voice, something that's often lost in traditional classrooms. Based on what we know about the brain and learning, it is helpful to change things up: environments, lighting, sound, etc. Flipped classrooms promote authentic, relevant learning and are likely to be more interesting to students, allowing for deeper connections to the material. Our brains thrive on novelty, and that is definitely a big feature of flipped learning. And here's more good news. There may be a link between the flipped classroom model and creativity in students. A 2015 study conducted by Abdul Rahman Al-Zarani concluded that flipped classrooms may have a positive impact on students' creative thinking, especially in terms of fluency, flexibility, and novelty, by allowing for more preparation, thinking, problem solving, and relevant, meaningful learning activities. He found that the flip model may actually promote higher order thinking through technology integration, The results of this study are very encouraging because we as teachers recognize that creativity and critical thinking are essential skills of a 21st century learner. The 4 C's have been identified as skills that will allow our students to succeed and to be competitive in tomorrow's workplace. These skills were identified over a decade ago, and teachers still struggle to find ways to teach these skills in a concrete way. Any opportunity to naturally infuse one or more of these elements into everyday instruction is something to get excited about. Alzarani's findings come with a huge disclaimer. In order for flipped classrooms to be effective, it is imperative to intentionally design and apply the technology tools that will be used. The teacher must also ensure that the in-class activities that support the at-home learning focus on deep student discourse, problem solving, and cooperative learning. When we look at existing flipped classrooms, are we sure those requirements are being met? In many cases, the teacher is not modifying the curriculum significantly, but rather just recording their normal lectures for students to watch at home. I don't believe the same results would occur if Alzarani's research were replicated in a classroom where the teacher wasn't making sure those crucial elements were in place. And there are concerns being raised about the model's effectiveness. Because flipped classrooms are relatively new to the educational landscape, we really have very little research to reference. As this model becomes more commonplace, we may learn more about how exactly compatible this learning style is with what we know about learning. A huge con compared to the traditional classroom structure is the issue of equity around what educators call the digital divide. If not thought out correctly, students with limited access to resources may have to stay after school or trek to the public library to get online. Others are forced to watch the lesson on a small smartphone screen, which may not be ideal for certain types of learning. Another thing to be aware of is the significant amount of teacher preparation, especially up front. It can add an extra workload on teachers who are already stretched for planning time. Does this image look all too familiar? Getting a video lesson right takes time, practice, and some technological know-how. And digital content should be created, not simply transferred. That adds up to a lot of videos. Parents and teachers worry about the amount of student screen time. Watching videos at home is adding to this screen time. Even if done correctly, messaging to and communication with parents is crucial in the effectiveness and reception of a flipped class. So you've weighed the pros and cons and think a flipped classroom might be for you? According to a 2015 article from the University of Texas, there are 4 big steps you need to take before implementing the model. First, figure out where flipping makes the best sense for your course. Which units or topics lend themselves to the flip, and what learning outcomes need to be refined. Next, look for in-class activities requiring students to apply what they're learning. What activities are typically rushed due to limited class time? What homework makes sense to work through in class? How can students be challenged appropriately to apply concepts and engage in deep thinking? Then you'll need to identify the content students will access from home. What resources will work, and how will you check for student understanding? What essential content will they need to know before class time? Finally, students need to be prepared for the new role they will play in the classroom. What expectations and procedures need to be communicated to students? What additional tools will help you coach students and keep them engaged in the guided practice? Some final words of wisdom. Get your administrator on board. Then brainstorm how to most effectively communicate the change to families. There will be lots of questions, and you need to be prepared and have the research to back your responses. Finally, this kind of transformation takes a big commitment. Don't be afraid to start small. Focus on a single class or even a particular unit. Take cues from your students to determine what's working well and what needs adjustment. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me with any questions. Your personalized learning team is here to support you in however you choose to use technology instructionally.